20 hours a week, that's all it took. Not 50, not 60, not the exhausting work weeks that define modern life. According to decades of anthropological research, some hunter-gatherer societies spent as little as 15 to 20 hours a week securing food and shelter. The rest of their time was theirs. That single fact breaks almost everything we assume about the past. We picture our ancestors as desperate, starving, clawing through every single day just to survive until nightfall. But the evidence tells a very different story. And once you hear it, you may never look at your own daily grind the same way again. So what were they actually doing with all that time? To understand this, we have to go back. Not to castles or kingdoms, not to pyramids or empires. We have to go back before agriculture, before farming, before the very idea of a job existed anywhere on Earth. For roughly 300,000 years, Homo sapiens lived as hunter-gatherers. That's not a small stretch of time. If human history were compressed into a single 24-hour day, agriculture wouldn't appear until the final 20 minutes. Everything else, the hunting, the gathering, the firelit nights, the long conversations under open skies happened before that. And for most of that time, humans weren't fighting a constant war against starvation. They were, in many documented cases, working less than people do today. This idea first gained serious scientific attention in the 1960s through the work of anthropologist Marshall Solins. He studied hunter-gatherer groups like the Jew, Hoansi people of the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa, and what he found stunned the academic world. These were people living in one of the harshest environments imaginable, dry, unforgiving, with no supermarkets, no refrigeration, no stored surplus. And yet, they spent only a small fraction of their week obtaining food. Solins gave this idea a name that still echoes through anthropology today: the original affluent society. Not affluent in the way we think of wealth. No mansions, no gold, no possessions stacked to the ceiling. Affluent in a different sense, entirely the freedom that comes from having few needs and easy ways to meet them. Think about that for a moment. We tend to measure a good life by how much we own. Our ancestors, in many cases, measured it by how much time they had left over once their needs were met. But how is that even possible? How could people with no technology, no machines, no modern medicine live with more free time than someone today with a smartphone, a car, and a refrigerator full of food? The answer lies in something surprisingly simple. Their needs were small, and their environment gave generously. In many hunter-gatherer societies, food wasn't scarce. It was simply spread across the landscape, waiting to be found. Roots, nuts, berries, small game, fish in rivers, birds' eggs in nests. A skilled forager didn't need to search all day. They knew exactly where to look, exactly when the wild fruit would ripen, exactly which animals moved through which valley in which season. Knowledge passed down for generations meant survival wasn't a guessing game. It was a rhythm. Compare that to modern life. Today, we don't hunt or gather in any traditional sense, but we still spend most of our waking hours earning the right to buy food, shelter, and safety. We call it a job. We call it a career. But strip away the language, and it's the same fundamental task our ancestors faced: securing the resources needed to live. The difference is, we've made that task take far longer. Now, before this starts to sound like a fantasy of paradise lost, it's important to be honest about the full picture. Life for early humans was not without hardship. Infant mortality was high. Diseases had no cure. A broken leg could be a death sentence. Winters could be brutal, and not every season offered abundance. Anthropologists still debate exactly how universal this leisure-rich lifestyle really was. Some hunter-gatherer groups faced far greater scarcity than others, depending on climate, geography, and the resources available to them. But even accounting for that uncertainty, one thing keeps showing up across multiple independent studies. The hours spent specifically on acquiring food and material needs were often shockingly low compared to the modern workweek. So if they weren't working 8, 9, 10 hours a day, what were they doing with the rest of their time? This is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating. They rested, they played, they told stories. Anthropologist Polly Weissner spent years studying the Jew, Hoansi, and found something remarkable about their evenings. During the day, conversations were often practical: who found what, where the animals were moving, disputes that needed resolving. But at night, around the fire, everything changed. The tone shifted towards storytelling: myths, legends, tales about distant relatives, ancestors, spirits, and the natural world. These weren't idle conversations. Researchers believe this nightly storytelling served a critical function. It built social bonds, passed down cultural knowledge, and even shaped cognitive development in ways daytime conversation never could. Children who grew up listening to these stories developed a deeper understanding of their community, their environment, and their place within both. In other words, the free time wasn't wasted. It was doing something modern life often struggles to make room for: strengthening relationships and passing down wisdom. There's a reason this hits so hard for a modern audience. Today, many of us come home from work too exhausted to have a meaningful conversation, let alone gather a community around a fire to share stories for hours. Something that once came naturally to our species has become a luxury we struggle to schedule. But rest and storytelling weren't the only things filling those extra hours. Play mattered too. Anthropological studies of hunter-gatherer children reveal something surprising: extensive time spent in unstructured, imaginative play, often mimicking adult activities like hunting, building, and cooperating. Researchers like Peter Gray have argued that this kind of play wasn't just entertainment. It was how skills, problem-solving, and social cooperation were learned without formal schools, without structured lessons, without grades or deadlines. Adults, too, had time for craft, for art, for simply doing nothing in particular. Cave paintings, dating back tens of thousands of years, like those found in Lascaux, France, and Chauvet. Cave weren't created by people too exhausted from survival to think about anything else. They were created by people who had the time, the mental space, and the motivation to make something beautiful, purely because they could. Think about that. Some of humanity's earliest art wasn't made in spare moments stolen from a brutal struggle for survival. It may have been made during genuine leisure time set aside for creativity, meaning, and expression. So, if life before agriculture allowed for this much rest, storytelling, play, and art, why did humans ever give it up? This is the question that divides researchers more than almost any other in the story of human history. Around 12,000 years ago, in different parts of the world, independently, humans began to farm. Wheat and barley in the Fertile Crescent, rice in China, maize in Mesoamerica. Agriculture spread, and with it came something new: permanent settlements, food surplus, population growth, and, according to a growing body of research, significantly more work. Farming is relentless. Crops need constant tending. Fields need clearing, plowing, weeding, watering, protecting from pests. Unlike foraging, where nature does much of the labor for you, farming demands that humans reshape the land itself over and over, season after season. Skeletal remains from early farming communities tell a physical story that words alone can't capture. Researchers studying these bones have found signs of increased physical strain, more evidence of malnutrition, and shorter average stature compared to hunter-gatherer populations before them. The transition to farming, in many regions, appears to have made human bodies work harder while eating less varied, less nutritious diets. This led biologist and author Jared Diamond to call the invention of agriculture the worst mistake in the history of the human race, a deliberately provocative statement, but one grounded in real evidence about health, workload, and quality of life during that transition. So why did humans make this trade at all? If farming meant more work and, in some cases, worse health, why give up the hunter-gatherer lifestyle? The honest answer is complicated, and scientists are still piecing it together. Agriculture allowed populations to grow far larger than foraging ever could. More food, even lower quality food, meant more mouths could be fed in one place. Larger populations meant more complex societies, eventually leading to cities, specialization, technology, writing, and everything we now call civilization. In a sense, humanity may have traded individual daily freedom for collective, long-term power. Farming communities could outcompete and eventually absorb or displace hunter-gatherer populations, not because their lives were better, but because their numbers were larger and their societies more organized for expansion. Once that trade was made, there was no going back. Populations had grown too large to return to a foraging lifestyle. The die was cast, and the modern concept of work, as we know it, began its slow, irreversible climb toward the exhausting structure we live inside today. From there, the story only intensifies. Agricultural societies gave rise to taxation, labor obligations, and eventually feudal systems where peasants worked land they didn't own for lords who controlled their time. Then came the Industrial Revolution, compressing human labor into rigid factory schedules, clocks, shifts, and quotas. The 8-hour workday, something many of us take as a fixed law of nature, is barely over a century old, first widely adopted in the early 1900s after decades of labor movements fighting for it. In other words, the modern workweek isn't some ancient, unchangeable feature of human life. It's a relatively recent invention, built on thousands of years of increasing demands on human time and energy since the shift away from foraging. And that brings us back to the real question at the heart of this story. Not just what ancient humans did with their time, but what that says about us right now. If our species spent the vast majority of its existence working less, resting more, and investing heavily in relationships, stories, and community, then the modern feeling of being perpetually busy, perpetually behind, perpetually exhausted, isn't simply how humans are. It's how a relatively recent chapter of human history has shaped us. That doesn't mean the answer is to abandon modern life and return to the wilderness. Agriculture and industry gave us medicine, safety nets, education, and comforts our ancestors could never have imagined. But it does mean that the exhaustion so many people feel today isn't an unavoidable feature of being human. It's a product of choices, systems, and history can always continue to change. Our ancestors didn't have jobs, deadlines, or overflowing inboxes. What they had instead was time for each other, time for stories passed down through firelight, time to notice the world around them without rushing through it. Somewhere between the last hunter-gatherer campfire and the modern office desk, something was lost. And maybe understanding that isn't just an interesting piece of history. Maybe it's a reminder of what we're still allowed to reclaim.